24, Aaliyah Carter lost her parents on her birthday. Months later, she lost her unborn child in a crash. Grief fractured her mind. One day in a park, she mistook a little girl for her daughter and held her, sparking fear and arrest. In court, she knelt, confessed her pain, and asked for punishment. The family saw her humanity and chose mercy. Justice listened. Healing began. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Charleston, South Carolina, woke that morning beneath a soft, gray sky. The Atlantic breeze moved gently through the palmetto trees, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. The streets were still damp from a light dawn shower, and the old pastel houses along Meeting Street seemed quieter than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Aaliyah Carter turned 24 that day. She lived in a modest second-floor apartment near the historic district, where narrow streets curved between centuries-old buildings. At 24, Aaliyah was tall and slender, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow in sunlight and dark almond-shaped eyes that held both softness and quiet intelligence. Her hair, thick and naturally curly, was usually pulled into a low bun when she worked. She carried herself with a calm posture, shoulders straight but never rigid, as if she had learned early that dignity was something you chose every day. She worked as a junior marketing assistant at a small local firm. She wasn't loud in meetings, but when she spoke, people listened. She had a gentle way of disagreeing without offending, of seeing tension before it erupted. That instinct, her mother used to say, came from growing up in a house where listening mattered more than shouting. Her parents were her world. Her father, Robert Carter, was a 52-year-old mechanic with broad shoulders, dark skin weathered by years of outdoor work, and hands permanently marked by grease that no soap could fully erase. He stood tall, not just in height, but in presence. His voice was low and steady, and when he laughed, it filled a room. He believed in fixing things, cars, broken chairs, even broken spirits. He rarely spoke about hardship, but he had grown up during a time when opportunities were not equally offered. That had shaped him into a man who valued perseverance over complaint. Her mother, Denise Carter, was 49, warm-faced and elegant in her own quiet way. She was of average height with soft features, expressive brown eyes, and a voice that carried comfort like music. Denise worked as a nurse at a local clinic. Years of caring for strangers had deepened her patience but also strengthened her boundaries. She believed fiercely in kindness, but not weakness. She had taught Aaliyah that compassion did not mean allowing yourself to be diminished. That evening, they were driving to her apartment to celebrate her birthday with a small homemade cake Denise had insisted on baking herself. Aaliyah had cleaned the apartment twice that day. She wore a simple cream-colored dress and small gold earrings her father had given her after she graduated college. On the kitchen counter sat paper plates, a half-finished bowl of fruit, and a single unopened bottle of sparkling cider. At 7:12 p.m., her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She almost ignored it. The voice on the other end was measured, official, careful. There had been an accident on Interstate 26, a red pickup truck, a collision involving a driver who had failed to stop at a red light. Her father's truck. There are moments when time fractures, when sound seems to echo from underwater, when the world narrows to a single unbearable sentence. They didn't survive. The city outside her window continued as if nothing had happened. Cars moved. Rain began again in soft, steady drops. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. Inside her apartment, Aaliyah dropped the phone. She did not scream at first. She stood frozen, her body refusing to process what her mind could not accept. Then the sound came. Not a cry, not a word. Just a broken noise pulled from somewhere too deep for language. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson lived across the hall. Mrs. Thompson was a 74-year-old white woman with short silver hair always neatly combed, thin framed glasses resting low on her nose, and a habit of wearing pastel cardigans no matter the season. She had lived in that building for over 30 years. Widowed young, she had raised 2 sons who now lived in different states. Her posture was slightly stooped, but her gaze was sharp and observant. She had watched Aaliyah grow from a shy teenager visiting with her parents to an independent young woman carrying groceries up the stairs alone. When she heard the crash of the phone and the sound that followed, she did not hesitate. She knocked once, then entered. She found Aaliyah on her knees beside the kitchen counter, hands trembling. Mrs. Thompson did not ask questions. She wrapped her thin arms around the young woman and held her. For several minutes, there was only the sound of rain and sobbing. Later that night, Marcus Reed arrived. Marcus had been Aaliyah's friend since college at the University of South Carolina. At 25, he was tall and lean, with a thoughtful face framed by closely cropped hair and dark eyes that seemed always to be analyzing something. He had studied journalism and now worked for a small regional newspaper. Marcus had a calm, grounded demeanor. He was the type who preferred listening before speaking, who believed stories mattered because people did. When he received her brief text, "They're gone," he drove nearly 2 hours without stopping. Marcus stood in the doorway of her apartment, uncertain at first how to help. He was not family, yet he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He helped make phone calls. He contacted distant relatives. He stood beside her at the hospital when she insisted on seeing them one last time. Funerals blur into fragments of black clothing and murmured condolences. The church was filled. Robert had fixed cars for half the congregation. Denise had treated many of them in the clinic. Their absence felt communal, not just personal. Aaliyah stood between 2 framed photographs, her posture upright but hollow. People told her she was strong. She nodded without hearing them. Grief does not always explode. Sometimes it seeps inward. In the weeks that followed, Charleston returned to sunlight. Tourists walked the Battery waterfront. Children ran through fountains in Marion Square. Aaliyah stopped answering most calls. Marcus tried. He left messages. He sent short texts. "Just checking in. I'm here." Sometimes she replied with a single word. Sometimes not at all. Mrs. Thompson continued bringing small containers of soup, placing them gently by the door. But the person who refused to let her drift completely away was Evelyn Carter. Evelyn was 72, petite but upright, her dark skin marked by fine lines earned through decades of endurance. Her silver-streaked hair was always wrapped neatly in a scarf when at home, and she wore simple dresses in earth tones. Her hands were small but firm, shaped by years of writing on chalkboards and grading papers. She had been a public elementary school teacher for over 30 years. She believed in discipline softened by love. She had lived through integration, through moments when classrooms were divided not by ability but by prejudice. That history had carved resilience into her character. When she walked into Aaliyah's apartment for the first time after the funeral, she did not cry in front of her granddaughter. Instead, she began tidying. Grief, in Evelyn's understanding, needed structure. She spoke in steady tones. She prayed quietly at night beside Aaliyah's bed. She reminded her to eat, to shower, to step outside, even if only for 5 minutes. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows again, Aaliyah finally broke. "I can't breathe without them," she whispered. Evelyn took her face gently in both hands. "You are breathing," she said, "and that means their love is still inside you." But even love cannot immediately repair a heart that has been shattered. On the exact day, 1 month after her birthday, Aaliyah stood alone in her apartment. The cake she had never cut was long gone. The decorations had been thrown away. The sparkling cider remained unopened in the refrigerator. She picked up her phone and scrolled through old photos. Her father grinning beside a rebuilt engine, her mother dancing clumsily in the kitchen, all 3 of them laughing at something forgotten. Outside, Charleston's sky was clear for the first time in days. Sunlight poured through her window, warm and indifferent. That was the moment she realized something terrifying. The world had moved forward, and she did not know how to move with it. The birthday that was meant to celebrate life had marked the dividing line of it. Everything before, everything after, and she stood at the center of that fracture, unsure which direction was still hers. 1 year after the night the sky broke over Charleston, the city no longer felt suspended in grief. Tourists returned to the harbor, carriage horses moved slowly along cobblestone streets, and the scent of salt and jasmine once again drifted through the warm Carolina evenings. For most people, life had resumed its rhythm. For Aaliyah Carter, life had not resumed. It had simply rearranged itself around an absence. She had grown quieter over that year, but not fragile in the obvious way. Grief had settled into her posture like a permanent shadow. She still carried herself with dignity, tall and composed, yet there was a softness in her eyes that suggested exhaustion rather than peace. Her laughter, when it came, was brief and often followed by silence, as if she were startled by the sound of her own joy. Daniel Brooks entered her life not as a dramatic rescue, but as a steady presence. Daniel was 28, slightly taller than Aaliyah, with a lean, practical build shaped by long hours of physical work. His skin was warm brown, his jawline strong but unassuming, and his hands rough from handling wiring and heavy tools. He worked as an electrical technician for a regional construction company, the kind of man who rose before dawn without complaint. His hair was cut short and neat, and he had thoughtful eyes that carried more patience than ambition. Daniel was not a man who spoke in grand gestures. He believed love was proven in consistency, in showing up, in fixing what could be fixed, in staying when others might leave. They had known each other casually before her parents' accident, introduced once at a community event through mutual friends. After the funeral, Daniel had begun stopping by to check on her grandmother, bringing groceries or offering to repair small things around the apartment. It was never intrusive. He never demanded conversation. He simply stayed long enough to be useful. Evelyn Carter noticed. Evelyn, now 73, had grown thinner over the year. The sharpness in her once energetic stride had softened into slower, deliberate movements. Her silver-streaked hair remained carefully wrapped. Her dresses still modest and pressed, but there were moments when she paused mid-step as if catching her breath. She never complained. She had lived long enough to know that weakness frightened the young more than the old. But at night, when she prayed beside her bed, her knees ached longer than before. She watched Daniel carefully in those early months. She had taught generations of children and learned to read character quickly. Daniel did not boast. He did not avoid hard work. When Aaliyah withdrew into quiet spells, he did not try to fill the silence with noise. He sat beside her, sometimes saying nothing at all. Loneliness can be louder than grief. By the following spring, Charleston bloomed again. Azaleas burst into color along quiet residential streets. Warm light lingered longer in the evenings. On one of those evenings, Daniel asked Aaliyah to walk with him along the waterfront near the Battery. There was no elaborate speech. He stopped beneath an old oak tree draped in Spanish moss, reached into his jacket pocket, and held out a simple gold ring. "I can't replace what you lost," he said gently, "but I want to build what's still possible." The proposal was not born from fireworks or overwhelming passion. It was born from exhaustion with being alone. Aaliyah hesitated only briefly. Part of her feared that moving forward meant leaving her parents behind. Another part feared the emptiness of nights without anyone to share them with. She looked toward the harbor, where boats rocked quietly against the dock, and nodded. The wedding was small, held in a modest church not far from where her parents had once stood. Mrs. Thompson attended, wearing a pale blue suit and dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Marcus Reed stood near the back pew. He had grown more polished over the year, now wearing tailored shirts instead of college hoodies, but his expression carried concern beneath his polite smile. He congratulated her warmly, yet there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as though he wondered whether she was healing or simply seeking shelter. Marriage did not erase the fracture in Alia's heart, but it gave her structure. Daniel moved into her apartment, and together they rearranged furniture, hung new curtains, and painted the bedroom walls a soft neutral gray. Life felt less hollow when shared. When Alia discovered she was pregnant, something inside her shifted in a way no one else fully understood. She stood in the bathroom holding the test with trembling hands. For several seconds, she did not breathe. Then she laughed, a sound Daniel had not heard in months. It was spontaneous, bright, almost unfamiliar. Pregnancy softened her features. Her once guarded eyes warmed with cautious hope. She placed her hands over her growing belly as if protecting something sacred. Daniel became even more attentive, attending every prenatal appointment, reading books about fatherhood late into the night despite early shifts at work. For the first time since the accident that took her parents, Alia allowed herself to imagine a future. Evelyn glowed with quiet pride. She knit small blankets in pastel shades, her fingers slower but steady. Yet the effort exhausted her. Some evenings she remained seated longer than usual, pressing her hand discreetly against her chest. Still, she prayed with renewed intensity, thanking God for restoration. Daniel's financial pressure increased quickly. Hospital visits, prenatal care, new furniture, medical insurance adjustments. Expenses stacked quietly but relentlessly. He took on extra shifts, returning home with dark circles beneath his eyes. He never mentioned the strain openly, but the tension tightened his shoulders. The baby's room was painted pale yellow. A small crib stood near the window. Alia often sat in the rocking chair, imagining lullabies her mother once sang. At 6 months pregnant, on a humid afternoon heavy with August heat, Alia left a prenatal appointment feeling cautiously optimistic. The doctor had commented that the baby's heartbeat was strong. The intersection near King Street was busy. Traffic lights flickered from green to yellow. She waited at the crosswalk, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. The car that struck her never slowed. Witnesses later described it as sudden, a sedan rushing through a red light. Alia remembered only a blur of sound, a force against her side, and the sky tilting violently. Rain began just minutes after the impact, as if the weather itself reacted too late. Daniel arrived at the hospital pale and shaking. The waiting room lights cast harsh reflections across sterile floors. Doctors spoke in clinical tones, careful but firm. The injuries to Alia were serious but survivable. The baby was not. There is a particular silence reserved for news that arrives twice in one lifetime. Daniel did not cry at first. He sat beside her hospital bed, gripping the metal railing until his knuckles whitened. When the reality settled, he lowered his head and wept quietly into the thin hospital blanket. Evelyn prayed aloud in the corner of the room, her voice trembling for the first time since Alia had known her. The driver, 22-year-old Caleb Whitaker, was described in court documents as distracted, rushing, inattentive. He was of average height with sandy hair and a face too young to carry the weight of what he had caused. He had no prior criminal record. His lawyer argued negligence, not intent. He received a reduced sentence: probation, fines, mandatory driving courses. To the legal system, it was a mistake. To Alia, it was the second burial of her life. The nursery remained untouched. The yellow walls felt like a cruel reminder. Daniel avoided entering the room at all. Medical bills multiplied. Daniel worked even longer hours. Exhaustion deepened the lines around his mouth. He loved his wife fiercely, but he did not know how to rescue her from this new darkness. Evelyn's health declined subtly but unmistakably. She coughed more often. Her steps slowed further. Yet each night she knelt, whispering prayers for strength she herself no longer fully possessed. Aaliyah lay awake in the dim hospital light one evening, staring at the ceiling. The future she had dared to imagine had vanished. Outside, Charleston continued as it always did, warm, indifferent, alive. Inside her chest, something had gone unbearably quiet, and this time the silence felt deeper than before. Autumn arrived in Charleston with cooler air and longer shadows. The heat of August faded into crisp mornings where fog hovered lightly over the Cooper River. Leaves gathered along sidewalks near Riverside Park, brushing softly against wrought iron fences as if whispering secrets the city did not want to hear. Inside their apartment, silence had become heavier than furniture. After the accident, Aaliyah Carter healed physically faster than anyone expected. The bruises faded. The stitches dissolved. The doctors said her body was resilient. But her mind had begun drifting in ways no bandage could contain. She sat for long stretches near the nursery door, though the room remained untouched. The pale yellow walls seemed brighter now, almost mocking in their cheerfulness. She often pressed her palm against the doorframe, but did not step inside. Her posture changed subtly. Once upright and steady, she now moved with hesitant slowness, as if unsure where each step would land. Her eyes, once warm and alert, grew distant. Sometimes she stared at nothing, blinking only when someone spoke her name twice. Daniel watched the change with quiet dread. He had always been composed, practical, but exhaustion had carved itself into him. At 29, he now looked older than his years. Dark crescents formed beneath his eyes from working overtime shifts to pay hospital debts. His shoulders remained broad, but tension stiffened his movements. He loved his wife fiercely, yet fear began to settle into him. A fear not of her, but of losing her in a way that could not be repaired. The first time she wandered from the apartment alone after the accident, Daniel found her sitting on a bench near the waterfront at dusk, barefoot, staring at the water as boats drifted lazily past. She did not remember walking there. The doctors used clinical language. Dr. Helen Porter became the primary psychiatrist overseeing her care. Dr. Porter was in her early 40s, tall and lean with chestnut hair tied neatly in a low bun. She wore minimal jewelry and spoke in measured tones. Her gray eyes were attentive, but not intrusive. Years of working with trauma patients had shaped her into someone who listened more than she advised. She explained gently that Aaliyah was experiencing severe post-traumatic stress disorder combined with major depressive disorder. Trauma layered upon trauma can fracture perception, she said. The brain, in its attempt to protect, sometimes confuses memory with present reality. Aaliyah nodded politely in sessions, but often seemed detached from the words. Children became a trigger she could not anticipate. At a grocery store, when she heard a baby cry in the next aisle, her breath would catch sharply. Her hands trembled. Once, she abandoned a shopping cart mid-aisle and rushed outside to the parking lot, tears streaming down her face without explanation. She began visiting Riverside Park more frequently. The park was wide and open, lined with tall oak trees and scattered benches facing the river. Families gathered there in the afternoons. Strollers rolled over paved paths. Children chased each other across grassy fields. To Aaliyah, the park became both sanctuary and torment. She would sit alone, watching toddlers wobble forward on unsteady legs. At first, she only cried quietly. Then, sometimes she whispered. Names that had never officially been given. Daniel grew increasingly uneasy. He tried to balance compassion with caution. When he suggested reducing her visits to the park, she responded with confusion, as if he were asking her to stop breathing. He began accompanying her whenever possible, though work prevented him from doing so consistently. One afternoon, Daniel's supervisor, Thomas Grady, called him into the office. Grady was a stocky white man in his 50s with thinning blonde hair and a stern but not unkind demeanor. He valued reliability above all else. Daniel's recent lateness and distraction had not gone unnoticed. Grady did not threaten termination, but the conversation was clear. Performance needed improvement. Responsibility did not pause for personal tragedy. Daniel left that meeting feeling cornered between duty and devotion. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter faced her own quiet battle. Her savings, accumulated over decades of modest teaching salaries, had already been strained by medical costs. When Dr. Porter recommended extended therapy and possible inpatient evaluation if symptoms worsened, Evelyn did not hesitate. She withdrew nearly all remaining funds to ensure her granddaughter received treatment. Her hands shook slightly as she signed the paperwork at the bank, but her expression remained composed. Mrs. Thompson noticed the shift as well. She once found Aaliyah standing in the hallway outside her apartment, holding an old baby blanket Evelyn had knitted. Mrs. Thompson gently guided her back inside. Though elderly, Mrs. Thompson moved with surprising steadiness when needed. She had lost a child decades earlier due to illness, an event that had reshaped her into a woman who recognized grief immediately in others. But even compassion cannot always prevent consequence. The day at Riverside Park began like any other. It was late October. The sky was pale blue, the air brisk but not cold. Children's laughter carried across the open field. Daniel had left early for work after a restless night. Aaliyah promised she would only walk briefly. Near the fountain stood a small girl with long brown braids bouncing against her shoulders as she ran in circles. She was about 5 years old, slight in build, wearing a pink jacket slightly too large for her frame. Her name was Emily Whitman. Emily's mother, Laura Whitman, stood nearby, watching attentively. Laura was in her early 30s, tall and slim with fair skin and soft brown eyes that rarely missed details. She wore her blonde hair in a low ponytail and carried herself with protective alertness. She had grown up in a suburban environment where caution was ingrained early. Her husband, Michael Whitman, stood beside her. Michael was 35, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven with dark blonde hair and a composed demeanor. He worked in finance and approached life analytically. He was not unkind, but he valued control. Aaliyah saw Emily from across the lawn. For a split second, perception shifted. The braids blurred into memory. The pink jacket became imagined familiarity. The distance between past and present collapsed without warning. She stood abruptly and walked faster than she intended. Her breathing grew shallow. Her vision narrowed. By the time Laura noticed the approaching woman, Aaliyah had already knelt and wrapped her arms around Emily. "I'm here," she whispered urgently. "Mama's here." Emily stiffened in confusion. Laura reacted instantly, pulling her daughter back. Michael stepped forward defensively, placing himself between Aaliyah and the child. Aaliyah did not resist. She was crying openly now, shaking. "I'm sorry," she repeated. I thought. But fear spreads quickly in public spaces. Someone dialed 911. The park's security camera mounted on a nearby lamppost captured the moment. The footage later reviewed would show only the physical contact, the rush forward, the embrace. It would not capture the whispered apology or the trembling confusion on Aaliyah's face. When officers arrived, Aaliyah remained kneeling, hands raised slightly as if surrendering to something unseen. Daniel received the call at work. He felt his chest tighten as he drove toward the park. He found his wife seated in the back of a patrol car, staring ahead blankly. She did not look angry. She did not look violent. She looked lost. Laura Whitman held Emily tightly, her own hands trembling. Michael spoke firmly with the officers, his voice controlled but unmistakably protective. To them, it had been a potential threat to their child. To Aaliyah, it had been a moment of shattered memory. Evelyn arrived shortly after, breathless and pale. When she saw her granddaughter inside the police vehicle, something inside her aged visibly. She spoke calmly to the officers, explaining the diagnosis, the trauma, the treatment. But systems move forward regardless of intention. That evening, after hours of questioning and documentation, formal charges were filed pending review. At home, Daniel sat on the edge of their bed, head in his hands. He loved her. He feared what might come next. Evelyn made a decision without hesitation. She contacted an attorney recommended through a former colleague. The consultation fee alone consumed what little remained of her savings. She did not regret it. As night settled over Charleston once again, the city lights reflected across the river as they always had. Cars moved, restaurants buzzed, life continued, unaware of the fracture widening inside one small apartment. Aaliyah lay awake, eyes open, replaying the park in fragments she could no longer piece together correctly. Her mind had wandered. And now, the consequences were no longer private. By the time November settled fully over Charleston, the air had turned sharper, and headlines had grown louder than the wind off the harbor. What had happened at Riverside Park was no longer a private tragedy. It had become a public narrative. Local news stations replayed the security footage in short, looping segments. The camera angle showed Aaliyah rushing forward and wrapping her arms around little Emily Whitman. It froze on the frame where Laura pulled her daughter away. The clip ended there. No audio, no tears, no whispered confusion, just the image. The caption beneath the footage read, "Woman charged in attempted child abduction at Riverside Park." Aaliyah Carter's name followed shortly after. The charges were formally filed: assault and attempted kidnapping. Inside their apartment, the television remained turned off. Daniel had unplugged it after seeing the footage replayed for the third time in a single evening. He stood by the kitchen counter now, arms folded tightly, jaw clenched. His exhaustion had deepened into something more brittle, fear mixed with anger at a system that seemed to move quickly without pausing for context. Aaliyah sat at the small dining table, hands resting loosely in her lap. She was thinner now, her cheekbones more pronounced. Her eyes remained distant, as though focused on something far beyond the walls of the room. When Daniel tried to speak to her about the charges, she listened, nodded faintly, but seemed unable to fully absorb the weight of what was unfolding. Evelyn Carter did not allow herself the luxury of shock. At 73, she had seen how swiftly public opinion could shape outcomes long before evidence was examined. She rose early the next morning, dressed in a dark wool coat and modest hat, and took a bus downtown. Jonathan Hayes's office was located above a small insurance agency near Broad Street. The building was old, the wooden stairs creaking softly underfoot. Hayes was 51 years old, medium height, slightly stooped from years bent over case files. His salt-and-pepper hair was combed neatly to one side, and his brown eyes carried a steady, observant calm. He wore simple gray suits, never flashy, never tailored for spectacle. He had built his practice slowly over decades. Small civil disputes, minor criminal cases, occasional pro bono work. He was not famous. He was not powerful. But he listened carefully. When Evelyn entered his office, she carried a folder containing medical records, discharge summaries, and therapy notes. Her hands trembled only slightly as she explained her granddaughter's history. Hayes did not interrupt. He asked precise questions. He requested copies of everything. "Intent matters," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "We must show context, not just reaction." Evelyn placed a cashier's check on his desk, the sum of nearly all her remaining savings. Hayes hesitated before accepting it. He understood what it represented. He agreed to take the case. Meanwhile, the prosecution began constructing its argument. Assistant District Attorney Claire Morgan was assigned to the case. Morgan was 38, tall and athletic with sharp features and dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes were alert, analytical. She had built her reputation on cases involving crimes against children. Years earlier, her younger cousin had been harmed in an unrelated incident, an experience that had hardened her resolve. She believed strongly in preemptive protection. She did not tolerate ambiguity when a child's safety was involved. To her, the footage was clear. Intent could not erase risk. Jonathan Hayes began his preparation methodically. He visited Riverside Park himself, standing near the fountain to understand distance and timing. He requested the full security footage, not just the clip shown on television. Though there was no audio, he studied Aaliyah's posture carefully. He noted her kneeling position, her hands raised when officers arrived. He then visited neighbors. Mrs. Thompson was the first to speak with him. She welcomed him into her small apartment filled with lace curtains and framed family photographs. Though elderly, her voice remained steady as she described the months after the accident. She told Hayes about finding Aaliyah holding a baby blanket in the hallway, about hearing her cry softly at night, about the vacant look that sometimes passed over her face. "She is not dangerous," Mrs. Thompson said firmly. "She is broken." Hayes recorded every word. He also spoke with a younger neighbor, Terrence Moore, a 27-year-old delivery driver who lived downstairs. Terrence was broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. He described seeing Aaliyah sitting on the porch steps several times, holding folded baby clothes against her chest. "She never yelled," Terrence said. "Never acted violent. Just sad." Hayes collected written statements from both. The prosecution, however, anticipated this approach. In pretrial discussions, Morgan dismissed the testimonies as emotional framing. Sympathy, she argued, does not negate threat. She insisted that multiple documented instances of fixation on children could reinforce unpredictability rather than excuse it. The tension between legal logic and human interpretation deepened. Judge Richard Coleman was assigned to preside. Coleman was 62, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age. His silver hair was combed straight back, and his blue-gray eyes were sharp beneath heavy brows. He had built a reputation over decades as unwavering, particularly in cases involving minors. Years earlier, he had publicly stated in a legal forum that crimes against children demanded zero tolerance. His courtroom ran with strict discipline. Emotional displays were discouraged. Order mattered above all. When the case file reached his desk, he read it thoroughly. He noted the psychiatric evaluations. He noted the charges. He also noted the public attention gathering around the matter. Across town, Michael Whitman remained resolute. He met with Morgan privately, expressing his concerns clearly. He was not cruel, but he was protective. Emily had woken several nights crying after the incident, frightened by the memory of a stranger grabbing her. To him, that fear justified caution. Laura Whitman, however, began to waver. She replayed the moment in her mind. Not just the embrace, but the expression on Aaliyah's face. She remembered the tears, the trembling apology. Laura had grown up in a family that valued fairness as much as safety. She was tall and composed, but her empathy often complicated decisions others found straightforward. One afternoon, while sorting through laundry at home, Laura found herself wondering what kind of pain could cause such a reaction. She had since learned about the miscarriage through community whispers. The detail unsettled her. When she mentioned it to Michael, he listened but did not immediately respond. "I'm not saying she shouldn't face consequences," Laura clarified gently. I don't know if she meant harm." Michael sighed, tension visible in the tightening of his jaw. Intent doesn't undo risk. Their marriage, usually steady, now carried a subtle strain, not of conflict, but of moral complexity. Back in Aaliyah's apartment, Jonathan Hayes visited for the first time. He observed her carefully. She wore a simple gray sweater and sat with her hands folded neatly. When he asked about the park, her eyes clouded. "I thought she was mine," she said quietly. "Did you intend to take her away?" Hayes asked, not accusatory, simply precise. Aaliyah blinked slowly. "No, I thought I had found her." Hayes recognized sincerity. But he also understood how such statements could be interpreted in court. He advised continued therapy. He requested updated psychiatric evaluations to present as evidence of diagnosed PTSD and severe depressive disorder. Meanwhile, public opinion hardened in online comment sections. Some defended her, citing mental health awareness. Others demanded strict punishment. The discourse was swift and often unforgiving. Daniel read none of it. He focused on shifts at work and returned home late, often finding Aaliyah asleep on the couch, therapy pamphlets scattered nearby. Evelyn's health declined further under stress. She hid episodes of dizziness from her granddaughter. She could not afford weakness now. As the first hearing date approached, the weight of accusation pressed heavier than any physical injury. Aaliyah stood one evening by the apartment window, watching headlights move along the street below. Her reflection in the glass appeared unfamiliar. Eyes hollow, shoulders slightly curved inward. She did not speak of fear, but fear lingered in the silence. The legal system had begun its process, and in that process, grief was no longer private. It was evidence to be dissected. The charges remained. The courtroom awaited. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and sharp. A gray December sky pressing low over Charleston as if mirroring the tension gathering inside the courthouse. The old brick building stood with solemn authority, its white columns rising against the winter air. Inside, polished wooden benches gleamed beneath fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above. Aaliyah Carter entered the courtroom slowly, her hands clasped together in front of her. She wore a simple navy dress borrowed from Mrs. Thompson, modest and understated. Her once vibrant posture had grown subdued. She moved carefully as though each step required deliberate thought. Her dark curls were tied back neatly, her face pale beneath the warm brown of her skin. There was no anger in her expression, only exhaustion. Daniel walked behind her, shoulders squared but eyes hollow from sleepless nights. His usual steady stride had lost confidence. He wore a charcoal suit slightly too large at the shoulders, one he had purchased years ago for a distant relative's wedding. His hands trembled faintly, though he kept them at his sides to hide it. Evelyn Carter sat in the second row once they entered. She wore a dark wool coat and her church hat, posture upright despite the strain evident in her thin frame. Her breathing had become more labored in recent weeks, though she insisted she was fine. Her faith had always been her anchor, but today her hands clutched her small leather Bible tighter than ever before. Jonathan Hayes organized his files at the defense table. His usual calm demeanor seemed thinner now, as if stretched by the gravity of the case. He had reviewed the psychiatric reports repeatedly the night before. He believed in context, in nuance, but the law was rarely patient with ambiguity. Assistant District Attorney Claire Morgan stood at the opposite table, posture firm and unwavering. Her dark suit was sharply tailored, her expression focused. She did not appear vindictive, only resolute. To her, this case was about safeguarding children from unpredictability. Intent was secondary to risk. Judge Richard Coleman entered promptly, his presence commanding silence. His robe hung heavily from broad shoulders. His blue-gray eyes surveyed the room without visible emotion. When he spoke, his voice carried authority honed by decades on the bench. The proceedings began with formalities, charges read aloud, procedural confirmations. The words assault and attempted kidnapping echoed through the chamber, sounding heavier spoken than printed. Jonathan Hayes rose to present the defense's foundation. He introduced Aaliyah's medical records carefully, laying out the timeline of trauma, the fatal car accident that claimed her parents, the miscarriage following her own injury, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and severe depression. Dr. Helen Porter's written evaluations were submitted as evidence. Dr. Porter herself testified briefly. She stood tall and composed, her voice steady. She explained how compounded trauma can distort perception. She described dissociation, the brain's protective mechanism under overwhelming stress. She did not claim Aaliyah posed no risk. Instead, she stated that the incident at the park aligned clinically with a trauma response, not predatory intent. Claire Morgan approached for cross-examination. Her tone remained controlled but firm. "Doctor, would you agree that regardless of trauma, physical contact with a child without consent can create danger?" "Yes," Dr. Porter replied evenly, "but danger and intent are not identical." Morgan nodded slightly. "Is it possible that trauma does not eliminate unpredictability?" "It does not eliminate it," Dr. Porter admitted. Morgan turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, mental illness cannot serve as an unlimited shield against accountability. Society must prioritize the safety of its children." The words settled heavily. Jonathan felt the balance tipping. Then the prosecution requested the video. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the footage from Riverside Park played on a large monitor. The grainy recording showed Emily running near the fountain. It showed Aaliyah standing abruptly. It showed her moving forward quickly, kneeling, wrapping her arms around the child. Laura pulling Emily away, Michael stepping in front. Officers arriving moments later. There was no audio. To the room, it appeared sudden, forceful. Aaliyah watched the screen. At first, she sat still. Her breathing grew shallow. Her hands began trembling in her lap. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher now, the room smaller. As the footage replayed at the prosecutor's request, something inside her fractured. She stood abruptly. A sound escaped her, not words at first, but a raw cry pulled from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her head with both hands. "I didn't," she began, but the rest dissolved into sobbing. Gasps moved through the gallery. Daniel rose halfway from his seat instinctively before catching himself. His eyes filled with tears, though he remained silent. He knew this was the breaking point Dr. Porter had warned about. To an observer unfamiliar with trauma, the outburst could appear defiant. Claire Morgan stiffened, but did not react emotionally. Judge Coleman's gavel struck sharply. "Miss Carter, you will control yourself," he stated firmly. "This is a court of law." Aaliyah's cries only grew louder for several seconds. She looked not at the judge, but at the screen, as if seeing something beyond the image. "I thought she was mine," she repeated, voice breaking. Some in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge Coleman's expression hardened. "If this behavior continues, I will have you removed from the courtroom." The words landed like a second blow. Jonathan Hayes felt a flicker of doubt rise in his chest. He had prepared arguments rooted in compassion and context, but compassion was fragile when confronted with visible chaos. He wondered whether he had underestimated how the outburst might reinforce the prosecution's narrative of instability. He leaned toward Aaliyah quietly, urging her to sit. She obeyed, slowly, though her shoulders continued shaking. Daniel lowered his head, tears slipping silently down his face. He had promised himself he would remain strong for her, yet watching her unravel publicly felt like witnessing the accident all over again. Another collision, this time invisible. Evelyn gripped her Bible tightly enough that her knuckles whitened. A wave of dizziness washed over her. For a moment, the room blurred. Mrs. Thompson, seated beside her, noticed immediately and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "I'm all right," Evelyn whispered, though her voice trembled. Judge Coleman called for a brief recess. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as people stepped into the hallway. Reporters scribbled notes quickly. Cameras waited outside for statements that would not yet be given. In a small side room, Jonathan spoke quietly with his client. "You must remain calm," he said gently, though his own uncertainty lingered. "They will interpret every reaction." Aaliyah nodded weakly, wiping her face with trembling fingers. "I didn't mean to scare her," she repeated. Daniel stood near the wall, silent. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, not from anger, but helplessness. When proceedings resumed, the atmosphere felt heavier. Claire Morgan reiterated her stance with controlled emphasis. "Your Honor, While we acknowledge the defendant's personal tragedies, the law must protect the vulnerable. Emotional suffering does not excuse behavior that places children at risk. Jonathan rose once more, his voice quieter than before, but steady. We are not asking the court to excuse harm, Your Honor. We are asking the court to understand context. Judge Coleman listened without visible reaction. The remainder of the session concluded without dramatic shifts. No verdict was issued that day, no resolution offered. But something had changed. The outburst lingered in the air long after the final gavel struck. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel approached Aaliyah cautiously. She looked drained, eyes red and distant. Evelyn stood slowly, leaning more heavily on her cane than before. She did not speak. Her faith remained. But the strain was visible. Jonathan gathered his files, uncertainty clouding his normally composed expression. For the first time since accepting the case, he questioned whether preparation and evidence would be enough against perception. Outside, the winter sky darkened early. Inside each of them, tension tightened. The legal process had not concluded, but the breaking point had arrived. The courtroom felt colder that afternoon, though the heating vents hummed steadily above. A gray winter light filtered through the tall windows, stretching pale lines across the polished wooden floor. The earlier tension had not dissolved during recess. It had settled into something heavier, more fragile. When Judge Richard Coleman re-entered, the room rose once more. His expression remained stern, yet there was a subtle pause in his movements as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the case file before him. The weight of procedure pressed forward, but something unspoken lingered in the air. Aaliyah Carter sat at the defense table, hands resting quietly atop one another. Her earlier outburst had left her drained. Her dark curls, once neatly tied, had loosened slightly around her temples. Tear tracks marked her cheeks, yet her breathing had steadied. Her eyes, though red, appeared clearer, as if something inside her had shifted from chaos to painful clarity. Jonathan Hayes glanced at her briefly. He had prepared additional arguments during recess, refining language in his notes, but he sensed now that words might not be what carried this moment forward. He closed his folder slowly and folded his hands. Claire Morgan stood prepared to continue the prosecution's argument. Her posture was firm, shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly in practiced confidence. But even she seemed cautious now, aware that the courtroom atmosphere had shifted in ways difficult to quantify. Judge Coleman began speaking, reiterating the seriousness of the charges and the importance of maintaining order. His voice remained even, though not entirely untouched by what had unfolded earlier. Then it happened quietly. Aaliyah rose without prompting. The movement was not abrupt like before. It was deliberate, slow. Daniel's breath caught from the gallery behind her. He leaned forward instinctively, unsure whether to intervene. His face carried deep lines of strain, yet his eyes softened with concern. Aaliyah turned, not toward the judge first, but toward Michael and Laura Whitman. Her knees bent, and before anyone could stop her, she lowered herself to the floor. A soft gasp rippled through the room. The sound of her knees touching polished wood echoed faintly. Jonathan Hayes did not move. He did not attempt to restrain her or interrupt. He recognized something different in her posture. This was not panic. It was surrender. Her voice trembled, but it was steady enough to be heard. "My birthday," she began, swallowing hard. "They were coming to see me, my parents. My father fixed cars his whole life. My mother worked nights at the clinic so I could go to college." Her words did not rush. They unfolded like fragile threads. There was a knock at the door instead. She paused, her eyes glistening as she looked toward the floor. They never made it. The courtroom remained silent. Daniel felt tears gather again, but this time he did not hide them. He rose slowly and stepped closer to the railing separating the gallery from the center floor, as if proximity could somehow steady her. Aaliyah continued, voice breaking but not collapsing. I tried to keep living. I tried to make my grandmother proud. I married a good man." She glanced briefly toward Daniel. "I thought God was giving me something back when I became pregnant." Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen. She had a heartbeat. Strong. The doctor said she was strong. Her breathing faltered, and then a car didn't stop. A murmur shifted through the room, but no one spoke. I never got to hold her. I never got to name her. I never got to sing to her like my mother sang to me. She lifted her face then, meeting Laura Whitman's eyes directly. "When I saw your daughter at the park, for a second, my mind told me she was mine. Not because I wanted to take her, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I forgot that she was gone." Tears streamed freely now, but her voice remained clear. "I am so sorry that I scared her. I am so sorry that I scared you." Laura Whitman's composure cracked visibly. She was seated upright beside her husband, fingers clasped tightly together. Her fair skin flushed, and her eyes filled. She had imagined this woman as unstable, unpredictable, but not as someone kneeling before her with such raw grief. Michael Whitman sat rigid at first, his jaw tightened as he processed each word. He was a man trained to compartmentalize emotion, to evaluate risk in measurable terms. But as he looked at Aaliyah, not at the video, not at the headlines, but at the trembling human being before him, something shifted. "Will accept it. I just need you to know I will accept it. I just need you to know I never wanted to take her away. I only wanted mine back." Silence filled every corner of the courtroom. Even Claire Morgan, usually composed and analytical, did not interrupt. Her face remained neutral, but her eyes softened momentarily. She had built her career on clear distinctions: victim and defendant, harm and consequence. This moment blurred those lines. Evelyn Carter gripped her small wooden rosary tightly, her frail fingers pressing into the beads. She did not speak. She only bowed her head slightly, lips moving in silent prayer. Her posture, though fragile, remained dignified. Daniel stepped forward further until he stood just behind Aaliyah. He did not touch her immediately. He waited, respecting the gravity of the moment. Then, gently, he placed his hand on her shoulder. His palm trembled, but his touch was steady. Jonathan Hayes remained seated. He knew that any attempt to formalize this moment would diminish it. He did not object. He did not elaborate. He let the truth exist unframed by argument. Judge Coleman leaned back slightly in his chair. His stern expression wavered almost imperceptibly. He looked down at the medical records in front of him. The documented trauma, the psychiatric evaluations, the clinical language describing post-traumatic stress and severe depressive disorder. He had presided over countless cases. He had seen manipulation, false remorse, strategic displays of emotion. What he witnessed now felt different. He cleared his throat quietly, but did not speak immediately. Laura Whitman could no longer hold back her tears. She reached for a tissue, pressing it to her eyes. Her posture, once rigid with protectiveness, softened. Michael finally exhaled deeply and lowered his gaze to the floor. No one applauded. No one moved. The silence itself carried more weight than any spoken verdict. Aaliyah remained kneeling, shoulders shaking softly. She did not look up at the judge for mercy. She did not plead for dismissal. She had asked for punishment. The courtroom did not feel like a battlefield now. It felt like a sanctuary suspended between justice and compassion. Judge Coleman looked once more at the file before him. He did not issue a ruling in that instant. He simply studied the documents again, slower this time. The silence in the courtroom did not break immediately after Aaliyah's words faded. It lingered, fragile and sacred, as if any sudden movement might shatter it. Winter light streamed faintly through the tall windows, casting pale reflections across the polished floor where she still knelt. Judge Richard Coleman adjusted his glasses slowly. His reputation had been forged in firmness. He had built a career on consistency, on drawing clear lines where society required protection. Yet as he looked over the edge of the bench at the young woman on her knees, something in his expression softened. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitman," he said evenly, "you have the right to speak." Michael Whitman rose first. He was still composed, still broad-shouldered and measured in posture, but his voice carried less steel than before. He looked briefly at his wife, who nodded slightly, her eyes still damp. "Your Honor," Michael began, "we brought this case because we were afraid. We reacted as parents." He paused, glancing toward Aaliyah. "But we have listened." Laura stood beside him now. Her blonde hair caught the light, framing a face no longer guarded but openly moved. "When I looked at her," she said softly, "I didn't see someone trying to take my child. I saw someone who lost hers." The room remained utterly still. Michael inhaled slowly. "We don't believe she meant harm. We are withdrawing our complaint." A murmur swept across the gallery, subdued but unmistakable. Claire Morgan did not protest immediately. She glanced at the judge, then down at her notes. As an officer of the court, her duty was not vengeance but justice. Without the cooperation of the complaining witnesses, the foundation of the case shifted dramatically. Judge Coleman nodded once, absorbing the gravity of the moment. He looked toward Aaliyah again, who remained kneeling, shoulders trembling faintly. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice firm but no longer severe, "this court acknowledges the seriousness of your actions. Fear was created. A child was frightened." He paused deliberately. "However, this court also recognizes the context presented." He glanced down at the psychiatric records once more before closing the folder gently. "The charges are dismissed. This case is hereby terminated." A breath seemed to release collectively from everyone present. "There will be a requirement," Judge Coleman continued, "that you maintain consistent psychiatric treatment and submit proof of continued therapy for a designated period. This is not punishment, it is protection, for you and for others." Aaliyah finally lifted her head. Tears flowed freely, but her expression held something new. Not relief alone, but humility. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. Daniel stepped forward fully now, kneeling beside her and helping her rise. His arms wrapped around her carefully as though she might dissolve if held too tightly. For the first time in months, his shoulders eased. Evelyn Carter bowed her head deeply, whispering a prayer of gratitude under her breath. The rosary beads slipped gently through her frail fingers. Jonathan Hayes exhaled quietly. He did not smile broadly or celebrate. Instead, he gathered his papers with calm satisfaction. He had trusted that truth, when spoken without performance, could still matter. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Cameras flashed as Michael and Laura exited first. Michael spoke briefly. "We made the best decision for our family," he said, "and for another family." Laura added softly, "Pain can make people look dangerous. Sometimes it just means they're hurting." Jonathan Hayes declined extensive interviews, offering only a short statement about the importance of mental health awareness in legal proceedings. In the weeks that followed, Charleston's headlines moved on. Winter turned to early spring. Azaleas began blooming again along quiet sidewalks. Aaliyah continued therapy with Dr. Helen Porter, this time attending sessions more regularly. There were still difficult days. Trauma does not evaporate with a gavel's strike, but the absence of legal threat allowed space for genuine healing. Daniel suggested they attend a support group for grief and trauma survivors held at a local community center. The group was facilitated by Pastor Samuel Green, a tall, soft-spoken man in his late 50s with kind eyes and a voice that carried steady reassurance. He had lost his own brother to violence years earlier, a loss that reshaped his calling. He believed that unspoken pain was heavier than confessed pain. The group met weekly in a modest room lined with folding chairs. People of different backgrounds shared stories: loss of parents, loss of children, loss of stability. For the first time, Aaliyah heard others speak of confusion and anger without shame. She began contributing slowly, voice fragile but growing steadier. Daniel listened as much as he spoke. He admitted his own fear of failing her, of losing her emotionally. Vulnerability strengthened them both. One afternoon in early April, Laura Whitman requested a private meeting with Aaliyah and Daniel at a small cafe near the waterfront. The atmosphere was cautious but no longer tense. Laura sat across from them, hands folded gently. Emily was not present. "I've been thinking," Laura began carefully, "about healing, for all of us." She explained that Emily had gradually returned to normal routines. Children often adapt more quickly than adults, but Laura herself had not stopped reflecting on that courtroom moment. "We believe people deserve second chances," she continued, "and we want our daughter to grow up understanding compassion as much as caution." Her proposal was unexpected. She asked whether Aaliyah might consider assisting as a part-time caregiver for Emily, under structured supervision at first. Short visits, gradual trust building, boundaries clearly defined. Daniel stiffened instinctively, but Laura's expression held no recklessness, only sincerity. "It would not be immediate," she clarified, "and only if you're comfortable." Aaliyah's first instinct was fear of repeating harm, fear of reopening wounds, but she also felt something else. Possibility. "I would only do it if it helps her," Aaliyah replied softly. The arrangement began slowly. Initial visits took place in Laura's presence. Aaliyah never touched Emily without permission. She remained aware of every boundary. Emily, curious and resilient, asked simple questions. "Why did you cry that day?" she once asked bluntly. "Because I was very sad," Aaliyah answered honestly. Over time, brief visits extended, not as replacement, not as redemption, but as restoration. Months later, Judge Richard Coleman participated in a community legal forum addressing mental health within the justice system. Standing at a podium before a modest audience, he spoke candidly. "Justice," he said thoughtfully, "is not only the enforcement of law, it is the discernment of context. When we fail to see humanity, we risk confusing pain with threat." The statement surprised some who had known his strict reputation, but those present recognized the weight of experience behind his words. Jonathan Hayes found his phone ringing more frequently after the case concluded. Referrals came quietly at first. Families seeking representation in complex matters involving mental health. He accepted each case carefully, aware that reputation had grown not from spectacle, but from restraint. Evelyn Carter's health continued to decline over the following year. The stress of the trial had accelerated what age had already begun. Yet she remained peaceful. On a mild spring morning, nearly 12 months after the verdict, she passed away quietly in her sleep. Aaliyah held her hand the night before, whispering gratitude. Evelyn had lived long enough to see her granddaughter forgiven, and forgiving herself. At her funeral, Daniel stood steady beside Aaliyah. Michael and Laura attended quietly, offering condolences. Pastor Green spoke of endurance and mercy. Mrs. Thompson dabbed her eyes with the same pale handkerchief she had carried since Chapter 1 of this story began. Life in Charleston moved forward again. Not without scars, but with understanding. Aaliyah stood one evening in Riverside Park, not alone this time. Emily ran a short distance ahead while Laura watched nearby. The air was warm, the river reflecting gold light from the setting sun. Aaliyah did not rush forward. She simply smiled. Justice had not erased her pain, but mercy had given it room to breathe. This story reminds us that pain does not have a color, a status, or a perfect explanation. Grief can make people look different from who they truly are. Sometimes it makes them silent. Sometimes it makes them react in ways that seem frightening. But before we judge a moment, we must ask what happened before that moment. In everyday life, we meet people carrying invisible battles. A tired cashier, a quiet neighbor, a parent who seems overly protective, a stranger who reacts too strongly. We rarely know the full story behind their eyes. Compassion does not mean ignoring responsibility, but it does mean choosing understanding before condemnation. Justice is not only about punishment. True justice includes wisdom, context, and humanity. When we reduce people to a single mistake, we risk becoming colder than the world we are trying to fix. But when we pause and listen, healing becomes possible for everyone involved. This story also teaches us that seeking help is not weakness. Therapy, support groups, prayer, community, and honest conversations can save lives. There is strength in admitting pain. There is dignity in asking for help. And let us speak honestly about something many people avoid. Racial bias still exists in subtle and open ways. Fear can grow faster when misunderstanding is mixed with prejudice. We must examine our own hearts. Would we react the same way if the roles were reversed? Would we listen the same way? Growth begins with self-reflection. If this story touched you, take a moment today to reach out to someone who may be struggling. Speak kindly. Listen more than you judge. Support mental health awareness in your community. Teach your children empathy alongside caution. Share this message with someone who needs hope. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Let us know if you believe that mercy can change lives. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of humanity, justice, and faith. May God bless you and your family with wisdom, compassion, and peace. If you believe that forgiveness and mercy are stronger than hatred, comment Amen.